All of you. Live in harmony with one another. Be sympathetic, love as brothers, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil, or insult, but with blessing. Because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from deceitful speech. You must turn from evil and do good. You must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. For the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. This is the word of the Lord for us today. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. All right, so Ken, I'm going to ask if you would do me a favor and take a look at your documents and see if you accidentally grabbed my sermon. So, oh, never mind, it was over here. Happens, stuff happens, right? No worries. All right, so we're talking about conflict resolution and being peacemakers, all part of this idea that it's the way of holiness, right? The big picture that we have here that we're painting is that Peter is talking about choosing holiness. And what we're discovering in the course of this, I guess, adventure about what the nature of holiness is holiness has a lot less to do with refusing to eat food for weeks at a time and strange mystery rituals or sacrifices or a forced continuous meditative stance. It's a lot more about self-control and our choices and doing the right thing by others. It's about actively choosing the right and to love God in every moment of every day of our lives, continuously focusing on how am I going to love God now, here, in the present moment. And what we come here to in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8 and through 12, is the fact that holiness, part of the way of holiness is to be a person who is a peacemaker. A peacemaker. These threads all coming together, these words, these relationships, emotions here in this passage, all these things coming together with the idea here as we come to the end of our section that we just read, a quotation from Psalm 34, which, by the way, is a wonderful psalm. We had a selection from it in a responsive reading this morning. But it's a wonderful psalm, a meditation, a wisdom psalm. And part of this thing that happens inside this particular psalm is it says, if you want to see God's blessing in your life, you must be a person who seeks peace and pursues it. To be a peacemaker. We observe a few things here as we get into this particular passage of Scripture. We observe here, first of all, this word finally. Finally. And that suggests the idea that we're talking about a list, a successive series of things. And so we look back into the previous passages, and we look back up all the way to verse 13 of chapter 2, and we see, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority. We see verse 18, slaves, submit yourselves to your masters, as we pointed out last week. Verse 20, or chapter 1, verse 1 of chapter 3, you see wives in the same way be submissive. And then we see in verse 7, husbands in the same way. So it's talking about mutual submission inside the household, just the way that Paul does in Ephesians chapter 5. Husbands to your wives, wives to your husbands. And so we come here lastly to submission now in the fellowship of faith. Last one on the list. He's saying, look back, think about this. I'm making a list of different ways we are to set aside our will. Remember, most of you will remember last week we talked about hupotasso and the idea of set aside our will, set aside our self-focus, our self-direction, our self-centeredness. And finally, he says here at the end of this list, among these things, as you're there in the fellowship of faith. How do we know it's the fellowship of faith? Because it says love as brethren. Love as brethren. So this is talking about inside the community of faith. I don't know about you, but there's an old joke that you may have heard. It says, I went to see the fights and the church service broke out. There's a certain association that you have sometimes with churches, that sometimes it can be a place of territorialism, of divisiveness, and all those sorts of things. And Peter is aware of those sorts of things already in the very first century. Apparently this has a very long tradition. And lots of people, sometimes they leave churches because conflict develops. A difference of opinion appears. And the idea is that, well, there should never be a difference of opinion inside a church. Oh, goodness sakes. How dare we fight over what color the flowers are on the windowsill? Someone brought these out. Here, these lovely flowers. Aren't they wonderful? And yet there was some concern. Hey, if we bring these out, they've been sitting in storage up here. Maybe someone put them aside. Will there be conflict over this? Well, I want to tell you something first, right off the bat. First thing. Conflict is not bad. Conflict itself is not something that is an evil to be avoided. Conflict isn't necessarily something that we should shun. In fact, actually what conflict means is that there's people who care. There's people who value certain kinds of things. There's people who have a vision and a direction they want to take things. And so it's okay. The problem is what we do with the conflict. The attitudes that we bring into the conflict that result in divisiveness and pain, denominational splits, church splits. It's the emotional charge we bring into these things. It's a loss of vision. It's a failure to connect. And into that situation, Peter steps in and he says, finally, I want you to think about hupotasso, setting aside your will, submission inside the body when it comes to dealing with conflict. So what do we do when we're dealing with a fellowship of equals? What do we do when we're here inside of our congregational church, right? So we have in mind the priesthood of believers here also inside this particular passage of Scripture. That's 1 Peter chapter 2. And we're mindful of the fact that we don't have a hierarchy. We don't have a pope. Thank goodness I'm not the pope. I would not want to be the pope. I don't want to have that level of responsibility where I have to dictate to all of you how you're supposed to live your lives. I don't want that. I simply want to explain the Scriptures. Dennis also wants to say, praise the Lord that I am not a cardinal. Right? And, all of you who are here today don't want to have this hierarchy between you and God. You want to be dealing with God on your own. You want to be celebrating and living in that priesthood of all believers. And so we're a fellowship of equals. Yes. I'm just a person up here who's using the spiritual gift God gave me. That's all I am. What do we do in the fellowship of equals when we have conflict? Well, Peter speaks into the situation and he gives us some guidance. And so let's think about this one here first of all. It says, seek unity. Now, I know all of you can read the passage of Scripture yourself, and you say, well, I don't see the word unity inside here. Well, we derive unity from some words that he does use inside of this passage, and that we are to seek for that. Conflict, when it brings out, sometimes the first thing that begins to suffer is truth. Right? And you see sometimes that when people are getting into a dispute that they're willing to bend the truth, and they're willing to bend principles, they're even willing to ignore core principles. They suddenly forget them. I remember one time when I was the head of the board for, and interestingly enough, a United Methodist Church Boy Scout troop. I was the congregational pastor across town, and the United Methodist Church couldn't find anybody who was willing to be the CEO of this particular Boy Scout troop, and I found out why when I was dealing with it. But here, there was two ladies that were in this particular troop, and you think, well, we all have a core principle that's important. We're here to make boys into young men. That's what we're all about. We want to do this thing, and we're all buying this, 100% together in this, and we all should get along, and there won't be a discouraging word said. Well, from the way I'm setting this up, you know exactly what happens then. Right? You had a couple ladies who had differing visions for certain kinds of things, and I knew both of these ladies beforehand. I knew they were both confessing Christian women, one of whom actually was attending the church I was a pastor of. And she calls me up in tears one day, and she's begging me to step in and mediate in a conflict these two ladies were having. And she confessed partway through this that as they were becoming rather heated, all of a sudden the F-bombs began to fly at each other.
Church ladies.
We are leaders in a United Methodist Church Boy Scout troop. Ladies! So I stepped in, and one of the things that we had to do is begin to discuss core principles and core standards of behavior and all those kinds of things. We had to draw ourselves back to what was important. So often, conflict is made worse when people begin to think this. You must think I'm stupid. Right? And that's when the vortex begins to turn. And if you think I'm stupid, and I know you think I'm stupid, then that means that all bets are off in terms of how I'm going to handle myself when it comes to core principles and principles of how we're going to behave. See that all the time actually in theological disputes. I've had plenty of times where I'm in a church and I'll say something about some side issue, and then someone decides, Pastor is wrong about this. And as we begin to have a discussion about this, it's very apparent that this individual has taken the position that I am, because we disagree, I must think he or she is stupid. In that case, Peter says, let's draw ourselves back to what's most important. He uses a word here, and it's this: live in harmony with one another. Now, that's a musical term in our culture. So you think harmony, and you think, so we're supposed to sit around and go, hello, Three Stooges, right? This is what we're supposed to do, live in harmony with each other. But if you look at the word inside the Greek, two elements here, homo, phronis. Phronis having to do with the mind or thought. Homo having to do with sin. And so have the same thought, have the same mindset, the same attitude. Look at core principles. What is it that we believe is absolutely true that we can come together on? Seek agreement first. What are the basics? That's what Peter's calling us to. Think first about what you both, in that conflict, believe is absolutely true, and you both won't give that up together. Come together. What is the common ground that you do have? Seek to be one in your ideas. Secondly, think about what you're communicating to the outside world about your culture inside your church. It says here, love as brothers. Now, it's basically stated as a verb, an action word with, basically objective case word, brothers. So act as if you were actually kind of a family. But it's interesting, if you look at the Greek, it just simply says Philadelphia. It says Philadelphia. And in the Greek, that is an adjective. Now, in our culture, Philadelphia is the name of a city that is the exact opposite of what the name means. Right? And it's not a city of brotherly love. But what he's saying here is so live and so act and so do that when people look at you as a community, they'll say, that is a people who are characterized as a place of brotherly affection. They live like a family together. What a wonderful place. And you know what? In families, there's disputations. In family, there's conflict. But what do? They have to come around the fact, well, we're all parents of the same child. We all share the same DNA. We have the same blood. And so there's some things that we agree on that must be true. Be that kind of church, is what Peter is saying. Be the kind of church that comes around your fundamental DNA. Come around the ideas that you know are fundamentally true, and treat each other with dignity as brothers, as sisters in Christ. Bear in mind, Paul has similar discussion. Now, there's all kinds of people out there, theologians, who say there's this dispute between Peter and Paul But when you read Peter and Paul side by side, it's like those guys were working off the same script. We shouldn't be surprised because they were friends. But Paul, in 1 Corinthians, he's talking to a divided church. He says this to them. As you're there in your division, he says, you have to bear in mind something. You're one faith, one hope, one baptism, one God and Father of all. So what does he call them to? Remember, Peter says, I want you to come around together around principles, come around together around the fact you're a spiritual family. What does Paul say? Paul says, come around this one thing, that you're all believing the same thing. Come around this one thing, that you have one baptism you were initiated to, this one truth. Come around this idea that there's one hope that you have, that someday Jesus will come back. Intellectual idea, right? Come around together the things that are the most important. And he says, remind yourselves that you have one Father, you're a spiritual family. Gee, Peter and Paul are talking about the same thing. Finally, in this little section here, seek unity, Peter also says, be humble. If you look here, it says here in this passage of Scripture, be compassionate and humble. And if you remember, this is all part of a series of statements about submitting ourselves to the greater thing, about setting aside our will. And so here he uses this term, tapephenos. Tapephenos has the idea of having a lower head in the position of perhaps a bow. And that word is actually used very often as the opposite of somebody who's translated pride, but when you look at the word, it means someone who has a swelled head. Someone who has a swelled head. Now, I think we all kind of have a picture of that because we have kind of a similar picture inside of our own culture. Somebody who has an ego the size of all outdoors. Right? Yeah. That's tapephones is the opposite of that, to lower that. To assume a position of humility before someone else. Not humiliation, not being a doormat, but setting aside the fact that, well, I have my idea, and I'm the right one, and I'm the smart one, and you think I'm stupid. As opposed to, maybe God is trying to do something here in our midst. Let's come together around what we agree on, and lowering our head, and being willing to submit for the sake of the greater good. So that's seek unity. But then the second thing here, he discovers something here, I guess, or I shouldn't say he discovers it, but Peter formulates something here that only recently conflict management people and our culture is rediscovering. Something that sometimes people call emotional intelligence. Now, this is kind of a trendy term. It's kind of almost a PC type of term. I did try to look up a definition for this particular word, emotional intelligence. And the definition, believe it or not, said this: emotional intelligence. It's having knowledge about emotions. So it's like saying knowledge, defined as knowing something. It's a definition that doesn't mean anything. But when you dig into the literature, it's talking about the fact that we have a certain understanding and we acknowledge the legitimacy. And we're able to communicate about openly the real emotional reactions that people have. And I think there is a place for that whenever we're entering into conflict resolution. Paul, or Peter, points us to that very same thing. See, in conflict, sometimes as we're dealing with self-will, we want to focus on our own feeling first. Here's what you did to me. The pathway of being a peacemaker requires us also to consider the feelings of others. This is not to deny our own hurt and pain, but we also must recognize the emotional state of others. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that you're saying that they have a right to feel that way, but you just have to listen and understand and know. Peter goes on to say two words here. He uses first the term sympathy, and then secondly, compassion. Sympathy, sympathos inside of the Greek. Pathos has the idea of the suffering. It's saying suffer alongside of others. Walk in their shoes. What is their pain? What is the source of their pain? Here it is. And then he uses the term compassion. And this one is eusplunknos. You can actually see it kind of spelled out in English right there. Eusplunknos. EU having to do with good, and splunknos having to do with the guts. You think, well, what's that got to do with it? Think about this. When you have a real strong emotional reaction, don't we say in our own culture to this day, that went right to my guts? Just tugged down me, and you felt it right here. Oh. Right? The Greeks understood this same phenomenon. And so they felt that's where the seat of the emotions was. In our culture, we think of it as right here. Now, if you're being a scientist, you say, well, it's up here in the frontal lobes. It's in the, that's why you get lobotomy and you don't have any feelings anymore. So, the scientists, they ruin the poetry, don't they? But the Greeks felt it was right here inside the guts. And so Peter says, when you have someone who is dealing with something troubling, you're having conflict, enter into the suffering, enter into the pain. Have good guts toward them. Give them the benefit of the doubt. On the screen, you see an infant form of the greatest terror known to all farmers everywhere. I think most of you recognize what that is. That is a baby woodchuck. Isn't this darling?
He's so cute.
Isn't he adorable? Look at him. He's nibbling on his carrot. He's nibbling on his flower. It's just such a cute little critter. And yet, within a few months, perhaps a year, he'll grow up and he'll be tearing down the entire sides of buildings. So, one time I was driving down the road and I was heading towards, I was going to go serve in the church I was serving at the time. And this was very early in my career. And I was very much, I'm very much a suburban. And all critters everywhere, I just love on critters. And, we're supposed to love those critters and be kind to them. And so I'm driving down the road and I hit a woodchuck. And I felt terrible about that. And so I got to the church and I was there at the function. And I was telling everybody, I hit this poor little critter in the road and I killed him. I feel terrible. And these are all farmers and they're like, no, you're a hero. You're awesome. It's so great. High fives and everything like that. They're like, this is a good thing. You've done it. And they began to tell me what these creatures are capable of. It's like, I have no idea. So sometime later, I'm with my wife at this point, and I'm driving down the road through some farms, actually. And the road is kind of slick and everything like that. And here comes a woodchuck across the road. And my wife is also a suburbanite, and she, all critters are wonderful things and all that stuff. I just kept on going because I'm not going to swerve on that rain-slick dirt road. Wham! I hit that. What did you do? That's a horrible thing. And I said, honey, let me tell you something. And I began to tell her about how I was a hero in the minds of all these farmers. And as soon as I tell them I struck, the Braid Farms was right there. We had just left their place. As soon as I tell Tom that I just hit a woodchuck outside his place, he'll probably throw a party. So fast forward now actually to Friday. And my wife and I, we decided to go up to Home Depot. And so as we're on the way to Home Depot, I come to a particular curve in the road that forces me to slow down tremendously. And just before the curve, just before I enter the curve, I can see there is an animal that's dead on the side of the road over here. Actually, it's in the middle of the lane on the other side. And so I'm slowing down, and I can see there's another animal right next to it that looks like it's kind of eaten on this animal, right, the dead one. And I can see this is a fresh kill because there's bright red blood splashed on this particular critter. So this is an animal that has not been dead for very long. And as I get closer, I realize these are two animals of the same species, but one is significantly smaller than the other one. And it begins to occur to me what exactly is happening here. This is Mama Woodchuck. And baby is trying to nuzzle this mama and get it up. And right in that moment, as the woodchuck is probably like right about where that stand is, it looked up at me. You're just as bad not even seeing it yet, just as I was. You see the eyes right there and how they're kind of just like normal. This animal, this woodchuck, had enormous, big, huge black eyes. And it was plain to me, this is an animal that's in fear, it's in grief, it's in sorrow. And knowing all that I have come to know about these animals, I still couldn't help in that moment but just go, oh my. And my wife saw this too, and I was driving away from the scene, and I said, boy, that was about the most soulful look. And she said, that was the right word, soulful. See, in that moment, I was able to look in the eyes of the enemy. And that caused me to take a few moments to think and reflect about the broken nature of our creation and how God made these animals. And if it wasn't for the brokenness of this world that we all live in, perhaps they would have had very different lives, and we would be able to enjoy them and have them as pets and all those sorts of things, and not be destructive creatures that they are for us. I don't know. But yet in that moment, I still could enter into that and see grief and fear and pain and recognize those same emotions in me. Now I tell you that because Peter wants us, as we are having conflict, to enter into the fear and the pain and the emotions and the motivations of the person that we're in conflict with. And I can tell you one time where this was very valuable to me. I was ministering in a place where there was this woman who was, in no simple words, it was a shrew. She was a shrew. And she basically has destroyed her husband. She's got some problems. And she began to, after the honeymoon period had worn off, began to engage in the same sorts of behaviors with me. And so one time, as his way of apologizing for her, he came to me and began to talk about his wife, this husband. And we were discussing her behaviors, and he said, you have to understand where she's coming from. This is a woman who is terribly emotionally, physically, and mentally abused by her dad. Lights went on. I said, so you're dad, and when I have a discussion of conflict, I am dad. And that changed everything for me. It helped me to deal with her in a different kind of way. It didn't mean there was never any conflict again. It didn't mean there was never tension anymore. But it did mean that I was able to enter into that situation. I could relate, because I experienced emotional abuse and mental abuse too when I was a kid. I was able to enter into that and be able to navigate conflict resolution with her, understanding her better. And Peter, with his experience already as a church leader, is able to enter into that and say, guys, gals, you need to listen to each other. You need to be, as a family, not just hearing each other and engaging each other and just simply passing by those things and disowning them. You see, these things speak to a connection that is more than just on Sunday morning. It's very hard to have constructive conflict with somebody who you only see them at 10:25 in the morning on Sunday through about quarter to 12 on Sunday morning. These things speak to a relationship which is built upon hearing each other where each other is at.
That's right.
That's why I so encourage you that when we have these church family events, like we're going to have a barbecue here on the 30th, please come. Please come. And that way you can get to know the people that you're with, and that way you can give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to dealing with each other, because conflict is going to come. It is. And the relationship you build with that person, having heard them and listened to them, entered into their pain as they've entered into yours, will enable you to have bridges which you can use to be able to bridge to each other a true solution in the gap of that conflict. Whenever is heard a discouraging word. And so now we enter into this quotation from Psalm 34. And here it is talking about don't render evil for evil and don't render insult for insult. And sometimes that happens in conflict. Someone begins to act evilly, like my two Christian friends who began to throw the F-bomb around inside the discussion. Peter says, I want you, before you even enter into the conflict, resolve that you're not going to answer back in the same way that you've been given if they give you evil. If they give you insults, that you're going to stand back and say, don't do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to answer the same way. In fact, he says, do this instead. He says, answer back with blessing. Now there's different words in the Greek that have to do with the idea of blessing. This particular one means to speak well of. So the idea is that when you enter into that conflict and that person says, you dirty so-and-so, the idea is now what you are to do is to see, I'm not going to answer back evil for evil, but instead I'm going to look for what's good about you. And I'm going to mention that, and I'm going to celebrate that. I will instead say, well, I understand we're having a conflict here. I want you to recognize something. I know how much good you've done for this church. I know how important you are here. I value the times that we've had together. I see it. And now I'm going to say that, and we're going to celebrate that together. Instead of saying evil for evil, to speak well of. Eulogate this. To speak a good word. I know that it's not very popular to mention individuals from the South in this particular time, but nonetheless, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things that we can use that are exemplary. You have, actually, let us not abandon this from a previous sermon. Pay no attention to the words below the line. But that's Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee was a Christian man, and he actually hated slavery. But this is a man who was the head of the armies of the Confederate Republic for a period of time. And at one point, a fellow general comes to him and says, there was this particular role that some of the generals were being asked to take. And so a fellow general comes to Robert E. Lee and he says, what do you think of General so-and-so? General so-and-so is going up for this promotion to take this particular role. And Robert E. Lee says, well, I think he's a right fine officer. I think he would do a good job, and I think that he would prosecute the war from that position very effectively. And so this general who's talking to him says, well, I know you're going for that position too, and you know what he said about you? He said you're a dirty so-and-so, incompetent, lazy, and just went right down the list. And so he says, what do you think of that? And Robert E. Lee responds, well, I do believe I was asked for my opinion of him, not for his opinion of me. Stay classy, right?
Yeah.
Classy individual.
Yes.
And that's where we ought to be inside the church. Instead of answering back F-bomb for F-bomb, evil for evil, insult for insult, just say, I know we're having trouble here right now, but I just want to say something. I see, first of all, that you care about this place, and that you want to see ministry happen. And while I don't agree that white flowers are best for the windowsills, I understand that you have a decorator's touch and you're good at it. And so let's see if we can come to a conclusion on this. That's all well and good, Pastor Wayne. That's really, really awesome. But what do I do if the other person is determined to still continue to treat me in an evil way? We recognize the fact that you can only be responsible for you, right?
That's right.
And so, there's a certain place where you're going to come and you're suddenly realizing this person has run off the rails and there's nothing I can do except for show kindness. What do I do if this person is destroying me, rubbing salt in my wounds? What do I do with this person if they're seeking to humiliate me and ruin me in this place? Come on, Pastor. Let's be real. Peter's got a word for you too. This is what he says. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now the context is, if I'm going to be a peacemaker, I'm going to execute that peacemaking to the best of my ability. And that's what I'm responsible for. And at that point, now I have to turn to God with my stuff. If that person is refusing to respond, refusing to resolve the conflict, refusing to deal with things in a healthy way, I still have to understand God's watching me, and I'm really responsible ultimately to Him. And what does God say here in this passage to us? He says that if you're a peacemaker, I've got my eyes on you for your blessing. My face is turned towards you for your blessing. I see the good that you're doing in the midst of this circumstance. And guess what? My ear is turned to hear you when you pray. Contrast that to what we read about last week. It says, for the husbands, if you refuse to do right by your wives and treat them with dignity and kindness, and yes, respect, ascribing worth to them, your prayers will be hindered. And right here in this passage, same idea. If you are doing the right thing in the midst of your conflict in the fellowship of believers, you've got my ear. You've got my eyes. I see what you're doing. I hear you when you call to me. I will be there for you. So, brothers and sisters, let us pursue peace. Let us seek unity where we can. Shared ideas, mindset. Pursue the idea that we're a family of God, and keep a low profile with that head. Humility. Let's be emotionally engaged with each other. And then let's also watch our tongues and watch our mouths. Instead, if we've got hard things to say, let's take it to the Heavenly Father. Let's pray to Him. And if we're faithful to Him, He'll hear our prayers. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we do thank you for this opportunity to check in with you and to understand your calling to us in the midst of conflict, Lord. We recognize conflict happens, and so, Lord, right now, here today, we ask that you would hear our prayer, that we would be faithful to these truths when conflict does happen, and that your name would be glorified in us as we seek to bring peace and resolution to these things. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.